Basically, he's a father of 3 kids that have been grown, that were reared here. Oh, actually, he and Sibby. Sibby gave birth to them. This is a little bit more science to the event. And so it's Ariel, who we all know very well, and Jacob and Noah, and wonderful, wonderful kids, and it was wonderful having them grow up in our community. Steve came here. It's okay to say Steve instead of Rabbi?
That's good.
Okay. Anyway, Rabbi came here in 1978, I believe, and it was a year before we arrived here. And he was a young guy then. As I remember, you were 27 when you came here, and you came out of a Reconstructionist background into a constructionist background. And I think it was a dramatic change for him, and you may address some of that, I don't know. But we came a year later, and it's always been an inspiring process to go to synagogue, to services, and to hear Steve's sermons, and especially, I think, is his interactions with people and with kids. And I was trying to think about your sermons, your talks, the way we discuss things. And the organization that he's developed, which is Sikha, it's an organization of conversations with the past. And I think, as I was thinking about you and your presentations, I think of you as being a weaver. As a weaver, there's threads, and we're the threads. And over the years, since I've known you, since we've been here, all these threads have sort of come together. They've been woven together, and there's like a beautiful texture that comes out. And I feel like in our talks and when you present your sermon, you immediately enter into a painting, and we're part of that painting. And I feel very fortunate that you've been able to paint us into your paintings, and we'll be able to participate in that. Steve has provided, I think, a unique context for the synagogue. We've seen it grow. We've seen the interactions grow, and I think one of the most exciting things is when you go to a bar bat mitzvah, there's this discussion that takes place, and I believe you introduced that to the synagogue. And suddenly, this child is up there. It's no longer a child. It's a 13-year-old young adult that, through Rabbi's efforts, has been brought into an adult view of our Judaism in our congregation. So, with that, it's yours, Steve, to talk whatever you'd like to do about 32 equals lev, which equals heart. And I guess you'll elaborate on that too.
Yes, I will. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you for the image of texts, contexts, textures. It's an image that we had not discussed, but it's an image that I really want to develop. And that accounts for the pile of textiles and texts sitting on the table over here. But in truth, we hadn't talked about this at all. So it is fortuitous, and the image of Rabbi as weaver is fortuitous. And if that's an image that I have helped to create and a kind of development that I have helped to foster, then I am honored by that, and it's already worth coming this morning in order to hear that somehow that image, not very often spoken, but very present, is an important one to you and to other people in the community. I also thank you for having a bit of a tension between how to name me, whether to call me Steve or whether to call me Rabbi. All of these things figure into a talk that I will say, first off, as a way of starting to pull on that thread of whether it's Steve or whether it's Rabbi, that I have come to a place of ripeness in my life and in my career as a rabbi, where I say it's a good thing. I'm ready to say it's a good thing for an organization of the congregation, or the congregation itself as a whole, to invite me to talk about what is, after all, an important era and an important set of events in which I figure prominently. I say it that way, kind of outsized immodesty, because that's marking a way of owning the role that was a very difficult thing for me to own when I had come right out of rabbinical school. I tend to be a shy and modest person. Here's the paradox: work out that shyness in public, in front of lots and lots of people. But essentially, look for me at an Oneg Shabbat, look for me at a Kiddush, look for me at a bar mitzvah party. You're not going to find me for very long standing in crowds of people. That's really not me. On the other hand, I can work that out in public in a pretty big way. Well, I want to remember all of those themes, and the image of weaving helps me to remember those themes, and the images of texts and textiles helps me to remember those themes as I begin the story. Let me begin the story with a text. Here is a copy of a work called The Fathers According to Rabbi Nathan. It's a very important work for me, a very dear work for me. It is the translation and scholarly treatment of an ancient piece of rabbinic literature, an ancient piece of midrash that was accomplished by my teacher, Rabbi Dr. Judah Golden, who was a professor of midrash at the University of Pennsylvania. While I was in rabbinical school, I developed a real love for midrash, for the imaginative, creative legends, the boldness with which the rabbis tell their stories and weave, as it were, their own stories into the stories of the Bible, living those stories and being lived through those characters in their own lives, strengthening their own lives, and in some way, as my teacher, Rabbi Golden, would say, escaping the loneliness that would come with being merely contemporary. That's too lonely a world. I loved midrash. It was my favorite thing to study and to learn and to think about when I was at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And I went out of my way to go down to Penn and to learn midrash with Rabbi Golden, with Dr. Golden. Now I've called him rabbi twice or three times. I never called him rabbi all during the time that I studied with him. Dr. Golden, Professor Golden. The synagogue, over 32 years of my rabbinate, has benefited from, let me say it that way, from my stance, from my ability to, and my interest in midrash, or suffered with it, one or the other, or maybe sometimes both. But that influence, that part of me that is interested in the ancient creativity, the ancient imagination of our sages, and the bold way in which they were ready to recontextualize, there's our word again, text, to recontextualize a story, appealed to me always, appealed to me greatly. When I was graduating from rabbinical school, I tentatively took a job in downtown Philadelphia at a congregation called Beth Zion, Beth Israel in Center City, Philadelphia. As, well, maybe it was an assistant rabbi, maybe it was an associate rabbi. They weren't so clear as to what they were looking for, but they did tentatively offer me a job, and I thought to myself, and Sabina and I talked about it, Sibby and I talked about it, should go someplace, one place. Let's just go one place. I never moved around in my whole life. I grew up in one house from the time I was 3 years old. Went to the University of Maryland that was down the street. Never really ventured forth in any way that was brave or new in terms of breaking ground, blazing a new trail. Let's just go one place to interview. Well, we began to look at the placement list. And on the placement list, congregations available to graduates of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, there was a synagogue in Durham, North Carolina, a conservative synagogue. Did not dissuade us at all. We grew up in the conservative movement. That's the religious language that we speak, the language of the conservative movement. Reconstructionism was a very good framework for me for rabbinical studies, one of the great curricula and organizations of rabbinical studies in the United States to this day. And it was the right place for me to go to school. It did not require that I forfeit my own inner language, my ritual language, or the language of Jewish life that I had learned to love and that I had led. So a conservative synagogue, that was really just fine. But was it enough to leave home for? Shall we even break the gravitational field of Philadelphia and buy plane tickets and come to Durham, North Carolina? Well, as it happens, an employer of mine and Sibby's in Philadelphia is a friend of Eric Myers. And he told Eric that there was this guy who worked for him, who taught for him, who was pretty sharp, and you should try to get him to come down. As it happens, Professor Judah Golden began his academic career at Duke University in 1950-51. He was a professor of Jewish studies, and he was also the Hillel director. As it happened, Sibby and I lived in the West Mount Airy neighborhood on West Durham Street.
It was for shared.
Well, we came down here to interview. We left Philadelphia on a bleak April, it felt like a February Friday morning, and got down here to that land that you see when Dorothy opens the door. You know? It was beautiful. It was blooming. The dogwoods were blossoming. The air was clear. The people were extraordinary. The tour of Duke was wonderful. I was escorted around town while Sibby was being escorted on her own routes. I was escorted around town by former Mayor Mutt Evans, who picked me up in front of the Duke Chapel in a great big Carolina blue Cadillac with a smile as wide as that Cadillac. Showed me around Durham and Chapel Hill. Well, we stayed with Earl and Gladys Siegel. We ate dinner with Arna and Bob Lefkowitz. We met with interesting people, and we found here a community of about 140 households, a community that was able to be responsible for itself and for its own life, a community that had been without a rabbi for a year, and a community that seemed to be well knit together in terms of its friendships and certainly its hospitality and its sense of solidarity. We were just taken and we fell in love. And we took the job. We came in the summer of the August of 1978 with a very clear mission. One of them, get everything ready so that we could welcome our baby when she was born in October. Another clear mission for me was to take this synagogue, which was moving in some ways in fits and starts towards being an egalitarian synagogue, and to make it, in fact, an egalitarian synagogue. That was one of the missions. That was one of the reasons why the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College was a good place for Beth El to look for a rabbi. The synagogue, the congregation knew that it wanted to take that step and hadn't quite figured out how to do that in a way that was total and complete. One of my jobs was to make that happen. I came down here prepared to do that. But first there was the holidays. And I'm not going to take you, is he going to go month by month through 32 years? No. I'm not going to do that. And we'll come back to the holidays in just a second. But I want to say that after the holidays were finished, it then seemed appropriate to make the move towards egalitarianism. And that we did. We took the steps towards becoming an egalitarian synagogue. And there were some members of the congregation who were feeling quite disenfranchised. They could no longer effectively pray with the synagogue. Before that, there had been an interesting and uneasy kind of compromise position. Those people, those men who needed to be sitting by themselves would sit right up in the front rows on this side, on my right side. And everybody knew that that was a place where men who needed to sit only with men would sit. There was no division between seating. Only males were called to the Torah for aliyot, and only males led the prayer services. But on the second day of a two-day holiday, women would be called to the Torah. So people knew when they could come to shul, when they should come to shul, when they shouldn't come to shul. When that came to an end, there were a number of people, prominent among them, the chairman of the Chevra Kadisha for many decades, Leon Dworsky, but not Leon exclusively, who said, I just can't come to shul anymore. It has nothing, I know why you're doing this. This is a good thing to do for the community. The community has spoken. It's not a good thing for me. I will still be part of the community, but I won't be in shul. That didn't sit very well with me, with my Reconstructionist, pluralistic background of schooling. nor, frankly, with the environment of davening that was mine in Philadelphia, where we davened with a minyan that was part of a larger congregation, but a minyan of people that wanted to daven separately and had its own way, and wanted to make its own way in the world. That had prompted a fantasy on my part to make such a thing happen here. I always thought it would be a more liberal minyan, a kind of cutting-edge liberal minyan, but it turned out that fate had a different idea in store. Here was a group of people that needed a more traditional minyan, a breakaway minyan that was more traditional. And so we started it. And I said to Leon, after Sukkot, we were taking the sukkah down outside here, the sukkah in its old location, over by the front door. And I said, would you like to start your own minyan? We have an extra Aron Kodesh, we have an ark, we have lots of Torah scrolls. Take them downstairs to what was in the social hall and have your minyan. He said, can we have a mechitza? And I said, yes, knock yourself out, have a mechitza. That was the beginning of something that turned out to be an extremely important part of Beth El and a feature of the life of the synagogue that came in an odd way from a Reconstructionist trained rabbi with a sense of a certain kind of pluralism who spoke a lot of different religious languages, conservative and Reconstructionist and even Orthodox, and so it was. Well, here's the Judah Golden text that served me well for such a very long period of time in terms of making the transition from being a rabbinical student to being a rabbi and helping to confirm me in this quest to be both a rabbi and also to pursue an academic career and also to bring midrash in a kind of academic way into a community, and luckily into a community that was filled with academics. Moving between a ritual language and an academic language was a great joy for me. I loved being wrapped in it, really rapt attention. R-A-P-T and W-R-A-P-P-E-D, wrapped and wrapped. And I found in some ways that my imagination was straining in order to do things. People were asking me lots of questions, but they weren't asking me the questions that were in this book. This is a rabbi's manual. They weren't asking me the questions that were in this book. They were asking me other questions. I had to learn how to think in other terms, to think about other issues, to think more broadly about life experiences and how people's experience when people would come and sit on my couch and their own reality sprawled out on my couch in front of those books nicely stacked. You know, all the books are in order, but lives? And here I was, a 27-year-old who dearly wanted to be called Steve. This was another point from your introduction. I thought that would be an extraordinary thing, to be called by my first name. And people did call me by my first name. Turned out that it wasn't really, on all counts, such an extraordinary thing. And I started to learn that when I called a congregant one time after the death of a parent. And I said, this is Steve Sager. And he said, oh, Steve, thank you. I mean, Rabbi, I'm sorry. I shouldn't call you Steve. And it went on and on and on. And he was clearly embarrassed. And I started to feel embarrassed. Embarrassed for him and embarrassed in some way that I hadn't owned the title. People didn't hire me to be Steve. The congregation hired me to be Rabbi Sager. And could I be both? I don't know. That was a work in progress. When I came down, I thought I wanted to be Steve. When I would walk down the horrid corridor of the Hebrew school classroom and somebody would call out Steve, I turned around and somebody called out Rabbi. I didn't know who they were talking to at first. So to be Steve was really important. I felt like that was a better way for me to address these questions. It turns out that wasn't totally right, the questions of this book. That wasn't totally correct. I needed to be something else. I needed to be a rabbi. So it was that a number of years later, the synagogue board actually talked about it. Maybe there were some people here who were present at that board meeting, I don't know. But the synagogue board actually talked about this. What shall we call you? People would raise their hands in the synagogue and, Steve, I have a question. And that didn't sit well with some folks in the community who needed me to own the title. And we talked about it very seriously. And what we decided was that in public circumstances, I would be rabbi. And when addressed in public, I would be rabbi. And when people wanted to talk to me privately, they would call me whatever they called me. That's the way it worked, but it took a very long time for me to really learn that. Speaking the language of the book, or transcending the language of the book, was a very interesting and important ongoing learning for me. One of the ways in which I learned how to think outside of the book has to do with this tallis, with this rainbow tallis that was designed by my teacher, Zalman Schachter. Now, Zalman was an extraordinary pioneer in creative Jewish thinking. And I had studied with him, and he was a neighbor of mine and a friend of mine from Philadelphia days. And I started to think, what would Zalman do? This was in an age before anybody was thinking about what anybody else would do. What would Zalman do? Zalman then designed this tallis as a fundraiser for a group that he had started, and I bought one. And I would stand in my office and wrap myself in this tallis and invest myself literally in Zalman. This textile, this texture, these textures, these colors, this text became a way for me to focus how it was that I was thinking. How could I think about things in a way that was imaginative and useful, and took from strands of tradition and wove them into the strands of people's real lives, the warp and weft of the way people were living their lives? This became a very, very important piece of textile for me. And it helped me deal with other texts. Here's another text. This was the text that we used every one of the 32 years that I was the rabbi here. Every year, this text was the one that we used on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Do you remember it? Give heed to the sound of the shofar. One of the few English pieces that we ever used. And I got a chance to see myself reflected, a mirror of a career and an approach to prayer and an approach to community that was reflected in the black cover of a book, if something can be reflected in the black cover of a book. It was the experience, and very much this was Zalman for me. It was the experience. It was the heart-mediated, not the head-mediated, that was the most important part of what I had to do, what I had to teach, what I had to present to people in community. Kol Nidre. Kol Nidre here, you'll never see it like this anyplace else. There's no other place like this that I know of. It came a little bit from Zalman, a little bit from a story that I read by David Frischman called Three Who Ate, a story about three dayanim, three judges, three rabbis of a community who on Kol Nidre set up a table on the bima and ate in front of the community to show that the community had permission to eat during this cholera epidemic where people really needed to eat, but they wouldn't eat unless their leaders ate. A very important story for me because of the way leadership was presented, and also because of the shadows cast on the wall by the yahrzeit lights that lit up the synagogue without this little shtibel, without any electricity on Erev Yom Kippur. And the shadows that danced on the wall, were they the shadows of the living or the shadows of the dead? In what way was this a larger community that was created by the shadows? That got my attention. That is how the yahrzeit lights on the bima came to be. Taking out the Torahs, the Hakafah, putting a candle in the ark. These are all woven from elements of other synagogue rituals that I've read about, all kind of coming into my own album and spinning its way together in a way that seems so right for us and now has become the way in which we do things. Why didn't we change Machzorim all those years? I know somebody wants to ask me that question.
Why didn't we change?
It costs a lot of money. There were a bunch of Machzorim from which to choose, and we didn't use the English anyway. We only used the Hebrew. That little bit that I recited to you from the beginning of a reading in the shofar service was about the only reading that we did all of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Think back. I would daven in English. Why did I daven in English? Because Zalman Schachter taught me how to daven in English. We didn't use the English. We only used the Hebrew. The Hebrew is going to be the same in any other machzor you choose. So why spend $5,000 on a set of other machzorim when you have the Hebrew here perfectly legible? I never told you what page Kol Nidre was on. Do you know why? I didn't want you to look in the book. Kol Nidre Candles are lit. We're singing Or Zaru Ala Tzadik. Everybody's standing up. The sun is starting to go down. The Sifrei Torah are being taken out. The presidents of the congregation, a community of leaders standing up there in their white kittles, the silver of the crowns, the flash of the light as somebody picks up a light and puts it in the Aron Kodesh that God forbid should be without any light even when all the Torahs are out of it. The beginning of a hakafa, coming back into the back up here, standing arrayed up like this with all of the presidents and all of the white and all of the majesty and all of the lamps and illumining their faces and the Chazan singing Kol Nidre. What do I want? I want you to look at page 208. I don't care. It's not a head-mediated, it's not, so this is the issue in an academic community that I came to learn about. When academics are at great risk. When we pick up a book, you know, it's a text. When was it written? Who was the editor? When was the last edition? Does it have any footnotes? Are there any people in the index whose names I know? We have our way of dancing around the book and of holding a book, but putting down the book is not something that we do so well. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur was, after a fashion, about putting down the book and relying on the inner resources. When I came on the bima for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur back in those days, when the bima was, everything was up there and up high and there was a great big podium up there, I had a great big stack of books with me. All those books with bookmarks and all those bookmarks with tabs and all those tabs with correlated tabs on the pages that we were going to do. And I would take the book and read and take the book and read and take the book and read. Over the years that pile got smaller and smaller and smaller. It became a proposition for all of us to use and to mine our inner resources. That's really how the community gets built. The empathy of conversation, of listening, the feelings of solidarity, the look, the unity of things. Here's the first white tallis that I ever wore here for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I really wanted to, because of that story that I mentioned before, that David Frischman story, I wanted everybody to be wearing white. I had this fantasy that everybody would be wearing white. And I wanted to do it now. I got this idea, I think the 2nd or 3rd August that I was here. And when I got this tallis. And I wanted to do it now, and there was no way to do it now, except that I thought, well, maybe I'll call Will Williman, who's the dean of the Duke Chapel, and see if he has any white robes that we can borrow. He said, yes, as it happens, we have these albs, these old monk robes, and we have a bunch of them. You can take them. So I did. And the first time people wore white robes here, everybody looked like monks. We had 20 or 30 of these. The next year, we got a seamstress who lived across the street in the house right across the street, across Green Street, to make us. We bought her a pattern and we got her to make us robes, to make us kittles. Those are the same kittles that we're using today. A community that learns how to use its inner resources, to mine its inner resources, that wants to invest itself in the vestments of the holiday, to mine its own spirit, to make imagination work. These were the things that were the most interesting to me. Here's another important textile that you might recognize. Well, I know it's here. Yes, it is here. This is our talit of Eliyahu Hanavi, of Elijah the prophet. Where did that talis come from? Bar mitzvah, early on. I've been here just a couple of years. There was a bar mitzvah, wonderful bar mitzvah, Stephen Klein. Stephen Klein's bar mitzvah. And after all was said and done, this tallis was here. It was left. It's a Gabrieli tallis. It was woven in a little in the Gabrieli studio, which was not that old at the time in Yafo and Tel Aviv area, and fairly expensive, and it was just left here. This is not the kind of thing that somebody leaves behind and doesn't come to claim. Called the family. Did anybody leave a tallis? Anybody lose a tallis? Have you heard anything? No, they hadn't heard anything. We put an ad in the bulletin. Nobody responded. I wore it for a month or so. Nobody said, oh wait, that reminds me of so-and-so's tallis and it's been missing. What is one to make of such an event? Did somebody really forget a tallis and then forget where he had left it? Back then it was probably a he. Where he had left it? Never to claim it again? Such a treasure, such an expensive thing? Well, in my world of religious imagination, that can't happen. There's another way to solve the problem which seems much more plausible. This is a gift of Elijah the prophet. I'm going to leave it here. Let's see what you do with it. And here's what we do with it, and what we have done with it ever since. It sits on the bima, on a chair of Elijah the prophet, in front of the ark, between the beginning of Elul and the end of the holidays, so that people who would like to sit and have an intimate face-to-face conversation with that which is represented by the ark and that kind of presence, the presence to presence, can feel enwrapped by this tallis. It's been used as a chuppah. It's been used to cover the chair of Eliyahu, Kisei Shel Eliyahu Hanavi at a Brit Milah. It's been used to carry a baby to her naming. Those are the only ways in which this tallis gets used. The only ways in which this tallis has been used at Beth El ever since it was left here, apparently, by Elijah. And you know what? That suspicion, that hunch, has become confirmation over the years. There is no other explanation for the presence of that tallis in our lives. So, of course, there's a daily prayer life, you know. And the daily prayer life is one that was characterized by this tallis. I needed to have something that was at once very traditional, but also different. And the blue stripe was an important thing for me. It was a way of staking out a claim on my own, a claim for myself, a different kind of prayer life. All the time that these things were going on, the synagogue, after all, really is built around prayer. I was also very interested in Hebrew literature, religious literature, and in the writings of, speaking of texts, of the Sfas Emes, an important Hasidic theologian, of Shai Agnon, the great Israeli Nobel laureate, of Yehuda Amichai, the great Israeli poet. And all of these helped to spin together a way of approaching literature and prayer from a very special point of view that enriched me. And I had the suspicion that if it enriched me, that it would also enrich others. At least that was my best chance. It may be that people didn't like my approach or like my style, but it was my best chance at being successful. Now, there were some times when people were not, or sort of early on, I suppose, when people were not enamored of my style, of one thing or another. Maybe it was the way I spoke, or the way I rambled, or the way I, whatever it was, felt prepared, or was prepared, or wasn't prepared. Rabbis have their up moments and their down moments, and there was a certain kind of learning curve, to be sure. But there were some people who took the idea of what I was doing as the rabbi and said, you know what, that really is not the model with which we grew up. This rabbi is getting other people to read Torah. This rabbi is getting other people to lead the services. This rabbi is getting other people, kids even, to teach bar mitzvah kids. That's not the way I grew up. That's not my definition or my ideal of what it is that the rabbi ought to do. And it was a sharp enough, clear enough, well-articulated movement of people, or group of people, that we really had to talk these things out. And I am and will forever be in the debt of people who decided that this was an important element for us to discuss, because it made me clarify a mission which would either ensure a long-term future at Beth El, or ensure that I needed to pack my bags and go to find some other place where my mission was accepted with more hospitality. And what was that mission? Again, I say it with deep thanks to people who had another idea and who spelled it out very clearly. And what I said, in effect, was, not in these words, was that I am at core, as I excavate to the bottom of my rabbinic mission, I am a coach. I'm a teacher. I am an enabler, empowerer. I will not do it for you. I will teach you how to do it. I will stand with you when you do it. I will help you do it. At the end of the day, I will not do it for you. That's the way I need to be as a rabbi. Well, that was clearly stated enough. Not everybody loved it, but everybody accepted it. And ever since then, we have been on this mission to live in each other's company, to mine each other's imaginations and inner resources, to build a community of a certain sort that is, I think, in so many ways unique. One other point of uniqueness that I should mention to you and say something about it for just a few minutes, and then I want to say something about this tallis, and then see if you have some questions for me. I may well have overstayed my limit, but I think I'm still within the range of tolerance here. A couple of years ago, I was in the shul where he is now a member in the Berkshires in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And I shared with him what I had done, and he said, "This is thrilling. I never would have been able to take it that way. I never took it to that place. And this is a whole new way of seeing the product of something that I did years ago, and I'm in your debt," which made me feel wonderful. Made me feel like I had really carried through a thread and woven it in a very special way that paid honor to my teacher. One more piece of textile, and then we're going to stop, at least for now, and maybe we'll get to do this another time. This talit, also a Gabrieli talit, like the talit of Eliyahu Hanavi, was a gift from Sibi when we got married. And I wore this a lot, almost all the time when we first came here. She didn't pick it out. She had our friends Eddie and Stacy pick it out because they were going to Israel, and they picked it out. But this was a very important tallis for me as we wove together, as we wove our family, as we wove a relationship that has now become a work relationship in yet another way. After Beth El, it certainly was the great relationship of family in Beth El. Rabbis need family, not only large family, widespread, widely defined family, but also family in the nuclear sense as well. And this tallis, which now I wear on Pesach, it is the blue of the Red Sea. It is the blue of the red, the blue of the sea tallis for me. So this is a Pesach tallis for me now, and it's a primary. These are primary colors and a primary textile among the textiles and texts and textures of the life that I've been talking with you about. It wouldn't be right to finish without talking about all of the people who helped our lives, all of our lives together. Most importantly, Arna Lefkowitz, who was a volunteer in a lot of different ways, and a volunteer. Even before she was employed here, she volunteered to do all of the kind of secretarial work and all the organizational work. And then she became an employee of the synagogue, and one of my really good friends and confidant, my very best friend in terms of what life in the synagogue was like, and a really important part, I think, of all of our lives. There were plenty of other people as well, but as I scan right now, I want to be sure to mention her as being part of the warp and weft of what's made life at Beth El possible in more recent years. Here's Krisha. I should mention Krisha too, who seems to know everything that needs to be known, everything that can be known, and it was always a little scary to have something in mind that needed to be done and find that it was really already done or on the edge of being accomplished. Plenty of other people, professional and lay, and educators and so on, but after having just drawn a few threads, really, into this weave, I think we should make an end and see if you have a question or two. If not to be answered right now, then perhaps in another installment. Yeah?
I have a question. Just want to, on a note of appreciation, our two adult children think of this place as a home. And I love that. And I think it comes from their the name is experience and many other things. But they love coming here.
Feels like home, smells like home, tastes like home. Yeah, it's one of the interesting things of this kind of stability, I think.
I too want to just say something, Steve. You know, for me, it was watching the thread evolve into what it became for our family, which was Zodic. A very special human being who, through his quietness, was able to enter into the souls. And we have, now that we have the next generation coming up, that, and Ezra having just been bar mitzvah, watching Jared and Ezra, it's really amazing to see the evolution and how comfortable they are and wonderful. And the conversation is teaching them to think, to be, and it's a wonderful thing. And it's something that you have uniquely developed in this congregation, and so thank you for that.
Well, yes, thank you. Yeah, Artie, Joel.
So I echo that, of course. The trajectory seems just very healthy. I wonder if you could reflect a little bit, Steve, on this tension between what the congregation thinks it wants and what the rabbi may think it needs. I'm calling it parental kind of thing. Sometimes your child doesn't really know what they need, but the parent, a skilled parent is able to coach them to see it themselves. I do recall a conversation you had with me when I was president, and you were trying to take a sabbatical, and there was all this resistance on the board. You'd like to remember, but I was in your court, but I said, I don't really know what to say. You just tell them they're going to be better without me, that they can do it themselves. And it's this thing about being the enabler. And that, of course, turned out to be true, but it was a matter of bringing them along. So what advice would you give, not just Rabbi Graber, but let's say generically to a rabbi in the community? How do you sort of get them to see what they maybe should see themselves, but they don't?
That's a wonderful question, and I don't know whether I'm adequately prepared to answer it in full, because it requires a lot of thought. But I would say that rabbis have to think about what is the bottom line of my rabbinate, and that rabbis need to be thinking, along with members of the community, how can we be stewards of each other's visions? You're the steward of my vision. As the president of a congregation and as a congregation, and I'm the steward of your vision. You tell me, what do you need? And I tell you, what do I need? And to be stewards of each other's vision is the best way, I think, of approaching this. To say it that way makes it a holy mission, makes it holy work, and takes it out of the world of politics, really. This is part of the mission of the rabbi. There were a number of things whereby I made a decision in a very non-reconstructionist way, where I said, no, this is going to happen because I'm in charge, and I've been vested with the responsibility for and taking the risk for making this decision, and I'm going to make it. So there's that realm. You don't use that very often. There were some times when I did. But mainly it is a question of hearing what everybody has to say and figuring out how to be the steward of everyone else's vision.
I think just because of the time, we have one more question.
Joel. Yeah.
Joel?
Oh, I was just going to comment on one of the things that you did.
A little louder, Joel.
I was just going to comment on one of the things that you did during your rabbinical leadership, which for me was both unique and in some ways brilliant, given my own personal Jewish background. I grew up in Boston. I belonged to the largest conservative synagogue in Boston at the time, and the whole history of that congregation was sequential secessions of schismatic groups who were dissatisfied with something the rabbi had done or the board had decided and split away and created or tried to create their own little congregation, which usually never survived and never succeeded. And I think what you did when there was that threat, so to speak, of secession was just absolutely brilliant. And this became, I think, the basis of a sense in this congregation that this was a community of inclusiveness and not a place of exclusiveness. So I just want to thank you.
Thank you.
That,
Well said. Thank you.
It's wonderful having the insight to what happened here. And I actually wrote some things. This is going to be part of the introduction, but I think it's a nice way to finish. And if you don't mind my reading this, so he practiced weaving. I want to finish on this view of text. He is a synagogue weaver of the kids, the parents, the community to integrate the fabric of our community. I see that every time when one of the older threads come back to visit Beth El. And I've seen this many times, older kids coming back. Steve's face, the exchange of smile, no handshake, no way would there be a handshake. A hug and a smooch on the cheek, they are still part of the fabric.
Thank you.
Steve?
Thanks, everybody.
You want to tell everybody this?
Oh, there's